We're going to preface our conversation with short readings from some of our books, and I'll get mine out of the way first. I wrote a book about nighttime in London, which involves spending time with nuns and exorcists and sex workers and all sorts. And I spent quite a lot of time with sewer workers who spend all their time in the sewers under London. So this is an extract from that. The sewers are often imagined as an unpatrolled, deregulated wilderness. They're imagined and correspondingly desired as the mephitic opposite of tamed civil society. But in truth, they mirror rather than reverse what goes on above ground. Flushers who work below Charing Cross Hospital complain about the overpowering smell of ether and about the number of times they've been stabbed by syringes while crawling on their hands and knees. Those who work below garages find themselves up to their necks in petrol, and those who happen to be rearranging the sludge below restaurants swear that they can tell whether it's come from an Indian or a Thai or a Chinese takeaway. Fat is the bane of flushers' lives. Millions of litres from half-eaten breakfast dishes, chip-laden frying pans or fast food joints are tipped down into sinks each day. Eventually, they find their way into the sewers. They represent the effluence of affluence. They are the graffiti that the contemporary leisureopolis scrawls on subterranean environments. 30 years ago, the Thames, unloved and abandoned, created few problems for flushers. Now the river's banks are congested with clubs, boozy eateries, art complex gallery cafes. All of them disgorging fat. I wade through some of it at Victoria Embankment. It is at once crunchy and spongy, like putrid bran, brown and white and grey, a pigeon shit potage sprinkled with an extra top layer of mop heads and tampons. Flushers tell stories of accidentally getting a gobful of the sewer flies who feed on the fat, or of metal grating giving way so that they fall into 8 feet deep fat quicksands. The mouthfuls of the stuff they swallow leave their guts raw and hollowing for months on end. But it's the bouquet that really makes their flesh crawl. You smell it initially, says one. You breathe it all day long. You pass wind, and what comes out is the smell of the fat. You can go home, you can shower as much as you like, even with washing up liquid, but at the end of the day you're still farting the smell of rancid fat. My wife will say, "Oh, I see you've been sorting fat problems out." Yet, the flushers do laugh, and they laugh often. They'll cackle as a hungry gang member finds an orange amongst the dirt and fat and promptly starts eating it. Or at the desperate worker who loosens his uniform and has a dump in a corner. Life in the sewers is hard, and humour, the coarser and blacker the better, raises flagging spirits. A flusher tells me that he bought his wife a bouquet of flowers on their wedding anniversary. "I suppose you'll be expecting me to open my legs for you," she remarked. "A vase will do," he replied. Another remembers the night he emerged from a sewer at Leicester Square, dripping of filth and shit, only to find a young woman tourist peering at him. He held out his hand. "Smell that? That's canal number 5, that is."
The New York I lived in 40 years ago was rapidly regressing, and had been doing so for some time. It was crumbling, boarded up, going out of business. It was a ruin in the making, and my friends and I were camped out amid its potsherds and tumuli. This did not distress me, quite the contrary. I was enthralled by decay, eager to chart its inevitable further stages. Ailanthus trees growing through cracks in the asphalt, ponds and streams forming in the mud of leveled blocks and slowly making their way to the shoreline, wild animals returning from centuries of exile. Such a scenario did not seem so far-fetched then. Already in the mid-70s, when I was a student at Columbia, the windows in my room in the tenement that passed for a dorm gave out on the plaza of the modernistic School of International Affairs, where on winter nights, troops of feral dogs would arrive to bed down on the grates of the heating ducts. Since then, the city had devolved even further toward the primal state. On Canal Street near Center Street stood a 5-story building that had been emptied of its human tenants and subsequently taken over from top to bottom by pigeons. A literal rookery in a neighborhood dense with the metaphorical sort. If you walked east on Houston Street from the Bowery on a summer night, the jungle growth of vacant blocks gave a foretaste of the wilderness that was surely just a few years in the offing, when lianas would engird the skyscrapers and mushrooms would cover Times Square. Back then, much of Manhattan felt depopulated, even in daylight. Aside from the high-intensity blocks of Midtown and the financial district, the place seemed to be inhabited principally by slouchers and loungers, persons selling loose joints, teenage hustlers, panhandlers, and site-specific drunks, persons whose flea bags put them out on the street at 8 and only permitted re-entry at 6. Many businesses seem to remain open solely to give their owners shelter from the elements. How often did a dollar cross the counter of the plastic lettering concern, or the prosthetic limb showroom, or the place that ostensibly traded in office furniture but displayed in its front window a Chinese typewriter and a stuffed two-headed calf. Somewhere outside, under an awning on a hot afternoon, there would be a card table, textured like an old suitcase with 4 metal corners, and around it, 4 guys playing dominoes. Maybe they'd have a little TV set up in a milk crate, plugged into the base of a streetlight, issuing baseball. On every corner was some kind of storefront that advertised Optimo, or Te Amo, or Romeo y Julieta. And they did sell cigars, also smut and soda pop and rubbers and candy and glassine envelopes, and sometimes police equipment. And there were donuts, muffins, snack bar, and chinas comidas, and hand laundry and cold beer, grocery and barber college, all your old friends. These places weren't like commercial establishments exactly, more like rooms in your house. They tended to advertise just their descriptions. Their names, like those of deities, were kept hidden, tacked up, could only be discovered by reading the license tacked up somewhere behind the cash register. At the bodega, like at the pubs that Orwell described, well, you could buy plantains and coffee and Malta and lard, or a single cigarette, a Lucy, or a sheet of paper, an envelope, and a stamp. Downtown, we were proud of not being part of the United States. That's condensing a couple of paragraphs there. We thought of the place as a free city, like those storied pre-war tropical nests of intrigue and licentiousness where exiles and lambsters and refugees found shelter in a tangle of improbable juxtapositions. I'd never gotten around to changing my nationality from the one assigned me at birth, but I would have declared myself a citizen of New York in a trice, as such a stateless state existed, its flag a solid black. What happened instead is that Reagan was elected, and the musk of profit once again perfumed the air of America. Sorry for my plosives. It took all of us a while to realize that this might affect us in intimate ways. We were fixated on nuclear war. So while we were distracted, money crept in, making its presence felt slowly, in oddly assorted and apparently peripheral ways. The first objective correlative to appear in our sights was the new phenomenon of street vendors. Before the early 1980s, you never saw people selling old books or clothes or miscellaneous junk from flattened boxes on the sidewalk. If you truly wanted to sell stuff, you could rent a storefront for almost nothing, assuming you weren't too choosy about location, that is. But now, very quickly, Astor Place became a vast flea market running 24 hours a day, with vendors ranging from collectors of vintage comic books to optimists attempting to unload whatever they'd skimmed from garbage cans the night before. Those effects of the deceased that had once been set out as pickings for all and sundry were now merchandise, the stock of whoever happened upon them first. The daily spectacle was delirious, uncanny. You'd one day find there evidence of your missing twin, your grandfather's secret diary, a photograph of the first girl whose image kept you up all night, and all the childhood toys you loved and lost. Ed, I'm going to quit there. Thank you.
So this is after the post-Reagan period and writing in the middle of pandemic lockdown in New York when the city sort of returned to disorder for a short and, for me, quite joyful time. Why do I feel such relief in the turbulence of the disorderly city? I keep asking myself this question, wondering what makes me thrill to broken windows. Yes, the chain stores are an affront to my politics. Yes, I can tell you why they're bad for the city, but I'm a psychoanalyst. I want to know how we arrive at our destinations. As a child, I was told to smile. I didn't do it enough. Adults pinched my cheeks trying to force it. They called me Smiley because I wasn't. Hey, Smiley, to which I only frowned harder. I was a defiant killjoy. Happiness can be an instrument, says queer theorist Sarah Ahmed, a technology of discipline, a way to straighten people out. For how many photos did my mother grit her teeth telling me to smile? I remember her knuckle in my back, stand up straight. But I was not straight. I would not go along with the program, a refusal that yielded an existential punishment that reverberates still, making it difficult to enjoy what most people enjoy. This coerced version of happiness can feel like submission to a regulatory authority. Don't you like this doll, this dress, this lipstick? Such demands for gender conformity, statements of wrongness, don't you implies you should, and what's wrong with you, might accrue to other demands to conform to more general ideas of what brings joy. Don't you like summer, sunshine, the beach, picnics, birthday cakes, clinking glasses together when you drink, restaurants, travel, and did I mention picnics? Girls who are really boys or tomboys or take some other shape of masculinity don't smile enough, and this adds to the ways we are disappointingly gendered for people. We often grow up to be unintelligible to others and ourselves. Out of joint, we are unhappy queers, a kind of affect alien, the one who converts good feelings into bad, in Ahmed's words. I wonder, do we also convert bad feelings into good? Leave it to unhappy queers to shape crumbs of joy from tribulation. Is that why I feel so good in this bad time? To be an affect alien, says Ahmed, is to be out of line with the public mood. And here I am, in alternative Times Square, bouncing on my bicycle wheels with the wheelie bikers, the weed dealers, the weirdos, while newspapers cry Times Square is dead, yet I find its streets so full of life. To be out of line emotionally can be a form of resistance against the demand to enjoy, especially when we're told to take pleasure in a world that is not working for us. It seems to me that loving what is not loved, wherever it is found, can be a defiant way to reclaim disparaged parts of oneself. I'm trying to make myself the problem, but why should I? I've always been the problem, the queer, gender-fucked, not smiling about the right things problem, the surly, introverted, won't wear a dress tomboy problem, the ambiguous object of obscurity, what are you, a boy or a girl problem, walking like a truck driver, swearing like a sailor, talking back with my smart mouth, too smart, you think you're so smart, I'll slap that smile right off your face, wrong kind of smile problem, the gone to college, snob, feminist, wrong kind of feminist, bull dyke and combat boots problem, the trans before trans was cool problem, pawn of the patriarchy problem, the shirt and tie but wrong kind of man problem, followed by the wrong kind of trans man problem, eventually the New York complainer problem, the still angry, too cranky, can't get over it, quit complaining, enjoy life, smile problem. And I'm right back where I started, even though I've spent a lot of time trying to fix myself so I could be less problematic, more socially acceptable, financially viable, more likely to survive. Didn't I successfully shed my working class accent, my ethnic name, my queer skin, passing in public as an unremarkable and unmarked middle class man? What could be more acceptable? And yet, the past that is not past stays with us, haunting the present. What if you're not the problem? What if the problem is the world? In my search for answers, I find my way to queer negativity, and this will inform everything I think about the disorderly city and my affinity for it.
For Orwell, writing in Down and Out in Paris and London, he says categorically at the start, poverty is what I am writing about. And he reiterates this at different points of the book. What does poverty mean to you, to both of you, in your writings, whether about Paris and New York or about New York?
It's a wide range of things, really. I mean, because no matter how poor you are, there are always going to be people who are more poor. For me, it has a lot to do with my family history. I'm from a working class background. My father worked in factories beginning at age 14. My mother's family were tenant farmers who lost their lease at the start of the Depression and had to move to the city. So they were always skating around poverty. And sometimes a little better, during my early childhood, my parents could buy a house, but then they could lose it too, and we had to emigrate. So poverty is always in my sights. I mean, even though I'm semi-bourgeois these days, poverty is never far from my thinking. I always checking to make sure you have staple goods, so, food in case like the money runs out. I'm always thinking this way. Even though I've been living in a house for the last 20 years, more than 20 years, I keep being semi-conscious of some invisible landlord who's gonna, and because when I started living in New York City in the tenements, this was still when landlords were actually physically present at your door, knocking on it, and you wanted the rent in cash, so they were like bogeymen. So anyway, poverty is a kind of weather that was always somewhere in my system, even if I'm experiencing good times.
Yeah, I could echo that as well. Maybe a similar background of growing up lower class and having an inexpensive house that was taken away by the IRS. My mother was able to borrow money from a friend to get it back. But that sense of precarity that I don't think ever leaves, even in my semi-bourgeois existence at this point in time, that's always there. I know my mind goes to Orwell talking about how the bourgeois don't have contact with the poor, right? And this lack of contact, and how Samuel Delaney also in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue talks about the importance of cross-class connection in cities. And when you don't have cross-class connection, you get this alienation effect, and this way in which what I've seen, a lot of us have seen, is how cities, and I'm in New York, so get policed to remove the poor, to remove especially the unhoused from the streets, so that the middle classes and the upper classes will feel comfortable and safe and psychologically safe, and won't have to look at poverty. But I think it's important poverty exists, it must be seen. It shouldn't be locked away in prisons, which is often where it ends up.
It seems in both of your writings that part of the elegiac quality of them is the loss of contact zones, and thinking of cities, and maybe New York particularly, as a place of encounter, just bumping into each other, contamination, contagion. It's a kind of clusterfuck, that this fear that you're almost aspiring and you're bemoaning its loss. Is that fair, Jeremiah?
Absolutely. Clusterfuck is a great word. Collision, contamination, all of that is what I think city life, what makes city life so exciting and vital, gets us all out of our bubbles, right? Of our individual worlds. It becomes much more of a collective possibility. And that is also what's under attack, right? That this collision is dangerous. The encounter with difference is dangerous because what happens when you encounter difference is all of those internal boundaries that you police, that we all police, these psychic boundaries, are under threat of breaking down, right? And when they break down, people break out of that sort of regulated normativity, and other possibilities become possible, right? Like revolution, which is we saw in 2020.
Well, yeah, I think of, great moments, for example, in the late 70s when we downtown became aware of hip-hop, and hip-hop became aware that it could do gigs in where we lived, and this was like this major cultural bridge that occurred right then. And actually, when you first asked the question, the first thing that popped into my mind was Samuel Delaney's great book, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, which everybody should read this book, especially its first half. Where he talks about the culture of the pornographic theaters in Times Square and how the sex that went on in the audience crossed classes every which way and built this tremendous kind of weird floating population that became really effectively classless and only available under those circumstances. But sex is, I guess, in that case, is a great unifier. Sex can be a great divider too, we know. But but that's like the most intimate form of crossing, and I never experienced that myself. But just living in a city, and this is true since the Middle Ages, is that the rich and the poor lived adjacent to one another. Sometimes they lived in the same building, back in before elevators, when the poor lived on the ground floor, or the top floor rather, so the rich could occupy the mezzanine, only one flight of stairs. The further we advance into the 21st century, the more the populations are being kept rigidly divided. There's like, even the middle ground such as they exist, like Times Square, for example, Times Square now, attempts to smooth over the mingling of the classes by making them unique, making everybody equally stupefied, basically, by making them architectural squiggles rather than humans, moving them through these entertainments and back out again, so you don't really notice who was next to you at Dave & Buster's or whatever. And it's going to be ever more so as the world becomes a gated community.
I notice more and more the language of seamlessness or contactlessness is kind of used in terms of transactions. And I know lots of people who find it unbearable to wait in a line, even for a minute, for a coffee. So that you order your coffee and you just
to handle dirty cash.
Dirty cash, yeah. But nobody's more dirty in your book, Jeremiah, than the people who live in the building with you. You hate them with a passion. Almost every page is just full of bilious, apocalyptic scorn for them. Can you tell everybody why you loathe them so and wish them dead?
Sure, I do. This is accurate. So when I talk about, I use the word hypernormative, right? So I'm not talking about average, everyday, normal people. I'm talking about people who I really believe are these sort of these perfect neoliberal subjects. So they've been completely constructed by neoliberal capitalism. They've like swallowed the whole, psyche of their minds have been completely taken over. They're part of this sort of Borg sort of entity. You watch them all they all do, in every city they do the same things. You can talk to somebody in San Francisco and in Berlin, and they'll tell you, oh, they do that here. They wear those white hats and their shoes are so white. There's never any dirt. It's as if they hover above the ground. It's as if they're always showering, and they do, and I hear they get washer dryers in their apartments, and they're washing their clothes every single day. And they have the golf clubs. And there is, I perceive and witness an incredible violence that they carry inside of them. They are very entitled to space. They believe that they can move into any space belongs to them. And if you can talk about the frictionless existence, this is what they're looking for, a frictionless existence. Moving through the city, looking down at their phones, nothing should disturb them. If you suddenly appear on the sidewalk in front of them, they'll look up at you shocked and indignant. How dare another human being exist in the city? How dare you be in my path? How dare you speak to me? And so there's something anti-human about them. They're anti-collective. And they're there to consume and to discard, and their existence, I have tried to feel empathy for them because I know that there must be suffering on some level, but I just hate them and I want them to go away. And they just ruin my life. They're like, I love the city so much, and they all left in 2020. I live in the East Village, so there's a lot of these people, they're very young, and every single one of them left. I think because they could no longer consume the city. And if they can't consume, they have no idea how to live in a city without being able to eat it and shit it out.
I was just doing a little thought experiment, thinking, what if we're being unfair toward these people? I mean, after all, it's like, we're slagging off a whole portion of humanity. Would we do that if they were because they were speaking a certain language or eating a certain food? So you imagine the white hats speak, and imagine them trying to articulate a position. What would it say?
Well, they don't have a lot of nouns. So when I hear them walk down the street, they say things like, so yeah, it was I was like, oh my God, and then he was like, and then, you know what I mean? And the other people respond the same way, they do know what they mean. I think too, it's important because sometimes people come back and go, oh, this is xenophobic or somehow. I say, this is, we're talking about, these are people with all the power and the privilege, right? And that's a very specific position. This is where I'm punching up, and I believe in punching up. Yeah.
Walking. There's so much of it, miles and miles, every day in Orwell. He's a tramp and he's tramping around. And I think both of you believe in walking as a kind of critical practice, as a way to glean insights. And there's an incredible section in one of your essays, Lucy, about night walking when you were younger. Could you kind of sort of describe for people just the lengths you went to and how you just divagated till dawn and beyond dawn?
Oh, my favorite walk. When I was in college, I went to Columbia. I was in Morningside Heights, and somewhere in the middle of the night, I'd walk down to the Battery and hop on the Staten Island ferry and walk around Staten Island for a while, then get back on the ferry and come back up. And the whole point was to time it so I could get to the Fulton Fish Market between 5 and 6 a.m. when it was at its height. And it's one of the things that's so startling about today's world, or conversely startling in retrospect about that world, was how I'd almost never see people walking on the street at night, not even that many cars. And the entire, everything, The financial district, nobody was living there, man. It was just deserted, you know. You could like sit on George Washington's head on Wall Street, nobody would have known. And that continued. So that I was doing that, like, say, around 72 or something like that. I was still doing it 10, 15 years later, basically. Maybe not quite as epic a walk, but walking at night and not seeing any pedestrians at all. That's why people say, weren't you afraid of, like, getting mugged? No, the muggers were, like, either, like, well, they were nodding, or they were watching TV, or they were trying to cop. So the muggers were otherwise engaged.
I remember the smell of the fish, even after the fish market had closed for, I might be making it up, definitely for months, possibly for years, and sometimes you would find just the bones in the cracks. I feel the city doesn't smell enough.
No, because, well, one thing that all these cities, I mean, I can't say universally all these cities, but I can speak about Paris and New York, is that, you know, they got rid of their marketplaces that were the direct connection between the farmer and the city. You know, so there was Les Halles, which started sometime in the Middle Ages, and then was finally put to death in 1969-70. And in New York City, where the great markets, Washington Market, Wallabout Market, just went. They're farmers markets, but it's nothing. This was, you know, these were not boutique farmers. These were like, you know, regular farmers back when there was something between boutique and agribusiness, which there isn't much of anymore. And so it was the daily connection, the city dweller, who might not see too many trees in the course of the day, depending on where they lived, how much money they had, but they could go to the market and they could go there and pick up, you know, discarded produce, second produce, you know, for free. And that's, you know, that's gone. I mean, it's been just segmented. These are two different industries. You know, the agriculture happens in agribusiness territory, and the city is where it's consumed.
Jeremy, you use the phrase, or quote the phrase, nostalgia for the mud. Can you talk about nostalgia, both the mud and the nostalgic impulse? And it seems like it's often used as an insult to dismiss somebody as nostalgic, and yet it seems you have some kind of time for it.
I do. I have a lot of time for it. Yeah. It is often used as an insult. I think you know, one of the problems it's been sort of used by the right to sort of be like nostalgia for the good old days of America, make America great again, kind of nostalgia. But nostalgia really, you know, it translates to homesickness. And you know, I think of the one sense of home is the home that you've never really found, you know, and as a transplant to New York, it was the home I was looking for, a place where I could be queer and different, and you know, than where I came from, and I could be a writer and be an oddball in some way, and be embraced by a people. And I found that as much as that can be found when I first arrived in New York, and that's what I feel has been taken away from me, and that's where my rage comes from. I think there can be a lot of rage in nostalgia too. But the nostalgia for the mud, you know, is sometimes thought about as a kind of slumming impulse, right? That someone from the upper class is going into lower class space, as Orwell did. But in its original usage, it was talking about a sort of sex worker who climbs the ladder and hooks up with a bourgeois guy, but they sort of say about her in a very derogatory way, you know, she'll always have nostalgie de la boue, you know, she'll always go back to the mud, these dirty people. And so I wonder sometimes, you know, what of it for me is about a return to some kind of, you know, muddy place that I come from, you know, and is that about my class origins, my cultural origins, my family? Is that about something that's more about transness, about the turbulence and the disorder of being trans? I don't know. I don't think I'll ever know.
Yeah, at one point you compare graffiti to being trans. And there's another kind of great sentence where you say, I am a gender climber, self-displacer. I have gentrified myself. Could you kind of elaborate on that? Because that's a really mysterious, suggestive sort of comparison. In what way is being trans like gentrification?
I wouldn't say that being trans is like
Yeah.
but the way that I did it, I transitioned in the early 90s when you really couldn't be trans, and that's of course becoming true again. But it meant that I had to assimilate. I had to be respectable. I was like, well, I'm going to be respectable transsexual because I need to survive. And I met a lot of trans people who were really struggling to survive, as trans people do on the margins. And so, I went stealth is a controversial word, but passed as cisgender and tried not to make waves, so that I would be allowed to proceed through life. And so I class climbed, and going from female to male is another privilege. Climbing, and then there's a racial piece in gender as well, how it's racialized, and growing up Irish Catholic and Italian, and how whiteness is an accomplishment, right? I feel like I became more white in some ways by sort of deracinating myself in terms of ethnicity. So there are all of these ways that I gentrified myself to be able to make it as best I could in the world. And there's a lot of loss in that, right? There's a lot of, you have to cut parts of yourself off in order to do that. So there's nostalgia in there too, right? There's grief and mourning.
We live in sort of strange times. It's Pride Month. Something like one of the commonest words in a lot of Orwell's prose, and certainly in his book about London and Paris, is the word queer. Everything is queer to him. Everybody he encounters, every street, every sort of detail, and you become sort of obsessed by this. What does he mean by it? It can't be an accident, or are we just being willfully anachronistic? This is maybe sort of just too big a question, but what do queer people know and do in cities that non-queer people don't? Because I'm probably the rumble. If you read somebody like Richard Florida, the urbanist, he says one of the ways in which cities should rebrand themselves or modernize themselves is to embrace queer people, because they are, what are they, gentrifiers, adventurers, seekers, affluent. So it's kind of instrumentalization of that. Many of the kind of queer places in Manhattan have been sort of disappearing or privatized. A lot of the language of kind of queer radicality has been sort of co-opted and sort of banalized. So, yeah, it is invoking kind of queerness, the crookedness, the off-kiltedness of being queer. Is that still possible?
I think so. I mean, queer negativity, I think, is the way through it, and trans negativity, right? People are starting to talk about trans negativity within trans theory and queer theory in academia, which is basically just the idea that, like, we don't have to tell happy stories. We don't have to tell the story of, like, and now I'm normal, and now I'm okay, right? And it gets better, and all that stuff, right? This is a kind of a neoliberal, homonormative kind of direction to push people into. And I think a lot of queer people now are pushing back and saying, no, I'm embracing my monstrousness, my weirdness, my crookedness. Don't straighten me out. And I think cities at their best are queer spaces, filled with all kinds of queernesses. Deviations, basically, is from the norm, is what that means to me. Yeah. Did you want to?
Well, for me, I've been out for less than 2.5 years, and so the project of interpreting my past life in the light. I mean, well, I knew I was I knew it when I was 9, right? But I was repressing it so deeply, so that like when one talks about excuse me. But when one talks about like queer spaces in the city, I mean, it's sort of beyond my experience. Yes, I know, but I knew about pre-AIDS gay life in Manhattan pretty well. I saw that firsthand. But as far as inscribing myself, all right. Well, it clearly wants me to shut up. Well, all I was doing was confessing my ignorance anyway. So, it's for me. I mean, I've always seen myself as an outsider, as a loner, etc. So the weird part of being queer now is actually belonging to something which I never felt I did before. I always really, truly, I mean, I had friends, right? But I did feel like I was an isolated atom among all the other isolated atoms of the city. The idea that I am now part of something, part of a community, part of a movement, etc., part of a, embattled minority. All of this is new in my life, and I haven't fully processed it yet. That's what I mean.
And I would say that outsider experience is also a queer experience, right?
Yeah.
I mean, queer doesn't have to mean sexuality or gender, and so, yeah.
Someday I would really like, maybe you, to write a book or write an article. It doesn't have to be a book. Write an essay on what queer means without using theoretical language.
Right.
That I would pay money, big time.
I do think we're going to wrap it up. It's 2:00, but we have time for some questions, if you guys are okay with that. I've got a microphone, so what I can do is I can run it over here.
That's okay, I don't need a microphone.
Oh.
I was wondering, so, if you still live in, why do you still live in New York? No, I don't mean to disrespect.
Yeah, right. I ask myself that question every day.
Like so many of us here probably.
Yeah. Mostly because the alternatives make me feel anxious and sad, more than I already feel anxious and sad in New York. I also think I have an unrealistic hope that things are going to change, and they changed in the pandemic, and so I know it's there. I know that sort of anarchic spirit exists, and that it's being repressed, and that with the right kind of alchemy, it will break through again. And so I'm there for that, and I'm there for those moments. I walk down the streets and somebody hits me with a bag of golf clubs, but then I see a bunch of like gender queer punk kids with pink and green hair, and I just feel like I can breathe, and it's one of the few places where I can breathe like that. So that's why I stay, for those moments of breath.
Coming.
So, like in the post-pandemic moment, though, some of the grimy old New York has come back, and we're also witnessing the sort of backlash to that by the normie basic golf playing types, and the politicization of that, right? We're seeing centrist Democratic mayors elected across a bunch of cities. Broadly backlash against sort of people viscerally seeing the griminess that you talked about loving, and sort of how that is sort of butting up against kind of the national politics of pushing back against progressivism broadly. Anyway, would love your reflections on that.
Yeah, I see a connection between the repression of post-pandemic cities and the repression of trans and non-binary people, because again, this thing of disorder, it threatens, when you have any kind of binary, any kind of normativity as a force, right? And so when you have that, you have people who are constantly policing themselves, right? To uphold the binary is to expend a lot of psychic energy to patrol internal borders of self. And what happens when trans people start to show up, and when you see graffiti or you see trans people, I think there's a similar effect of it is a contagious. It gets inside, and you're shown another way to be. When people see another way to be, there's a potential for change. And then you have stuff like the patriarchy crumbling and white supremacy crumbling, and they don't want that to happen. And so all of this must be repressed violently by police, by the state.
And if you're going to maintain male supremacy, you cannot have deserters. You cannot have blurring of the lines, because, otherwise they're not supreme anymore.
One more?
Here?
This is a question for Lucy about Paris and London. Just reflect on the fact that the Parisians can occupy their streets for months on end, protesting a change in their welfare state, and we just kind of go with the corporatization and control.
Well, these are partly historical traditions, one of my favorite, one thing that I've been told of various times is that, those metal shields they keep around the roots of trees. Every time there's going to be a demonstration, the first thing the cops do is 10 trucks around to pick those up, because they're used to make barricades. And you can see them in the pictures of the Paris Commune, and they still have them today. So there's, there's not only the French Revolution, there's the jacqueries of the 13th century. America, on the other hand, has always squelched those kinds of efforts. There is no long tradition of popular uprising. Since the bourgeois American Revolution. And of course, one of the reasons that the United States has so little tradition of political organization and that kind of dissent is through racism, saying to workers, you are not the scum of the earth, because there are these people over there who are worse than you are. You're actually you're just as good as us, you just make less money, but if you work harder, you'll be in. So there you are. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Exactly.